one thing that I learned both politically before this, but also through personal experience being a victim of crime, is that the court exists for the benefit of the defendant, not for the benefit of the victim, actually.
Of course, the court's there to give the defendants due process.
Right. Due process, yeah. Exactly.
Welcome to the Cutrone Zone. We're back. It's another Friday with our track coach and the Last Marxist, Chris Cutrone. Yesterday, I interviewed Fakhri Al-Sawadi, I think is his name, and he is a new member of the Platypus Affiliate Society. And we were discussing whether or not we considered ourselves to be Marxists or not. And he said to me, there's only one Marxist. It is Chris Cutrone, the Last Marxist.
All right. So
neither of us
thing is working.
Yeah, I said that sounds a little bit too much like a cult of personality for me. I'm not sure. I know Chris, great guy. Wouldn't want to saddle him with the responsibility of being the only Marxist in the world. But perhaps it's true, Chris, because what we're going to talk.
True.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be a strange thing. This is the way that I always put it. So since I started my blog for Platypus, The Last Marxist, many years ago, just to be able to compile my writings that aren't published in the PR necessarily in the Platypus Review, and recordings of things that I did that aren't otherwise available. And I was super ironic about it. But also there's something kind of tragic about it, right? So, the fact that it might fall to us, let's just say, you and I, Doug, let's say that we are the Last Marxists.
Yeah, I need your endorsement, Chris. Let everyone know I'm also.
So let's grant that. But I think humanity's in trouble. If that's the case, then humanity might be in trouble. So I didn't seek out this position, of being the last Marxist. I don't welcome it. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but I do feel like, okay, I have something to contribute to the world. And the real question is, does Marxism have anything to contribute to the world? Not do I have something to contribute to the world as the last Marxist, but is Marxism going to be useful?
Well, I asked you to come on again. Of course, we do this every couple of weeks, every 2 weeks, hopefully. But I wanted to talk to you about why the left is necessary,
right,
and what it means that there isn't a left for politics in general. I thought we could talk about the American Revolution and the left, which is I think that's the last essay.
Final essay in the Death of the
Millennial Left, which, by the way, I should point out is available as a print edition, paper. You could get it as an ebook and now as an audiobook. In fact, I may run a short clip from the audiobook in this episode so that people can get a sense of what I'm like as an audiobook narrator and how important how good it is, the audiobook. Trump's election gave the left something to do. They should be grateful. They would have been bored under Hillary, especially after 8 years of Obama. Fascism is much more exciting, isn't it? But I would have been grateful if Hillary had been elected instead. Saturday Night Live's jokes about Hillary are much funnier than about Trump. My family voted for Trump, mostly. My mother and brother and his wife voted for Trump. But my father voted for Hillary. When Hillary collapsed due to fatigue from pneumonia, my father dutifully went to get his pneumonia shot. But my mother previously had voted twice for Obama. I'm not sure if my father did too. He might have voted for McCain and Romney. In the primaries, I intended to vote for Bernie, but it turned out the Democrats sent the wrong ballots to my precinct, which was more likely to vote for Bernie than other precincts. I thus personally witnessed in action the Democrats' suppression of votes for Bernie in the primaries. So I went to the empty Republican line and voted for Trump. In November, too, I knew that Hillary would win Illinois, but I wanted her to win by 1 vote less. No sense rewarding the Democrats for being greedy. I expected Trump to win. From the very moment that Trump descended the golden escalator and announced his candidacy, I thought he could win. As time went on, I increasingly thought that he would win. The main thing I was thinking at the time, I was feeling a bit down. I think it was in the wake of the two things. One was the allegations against Russell Brand,
Yeah.
which had emerged, and then
Yeah.
also the reaction to the medical event that Matt Christman has. He's in the hospital now. I don't know what his condition is. I don't know if he's conscious or unconscious. I don't know anything really.
Wow.
But he had some sort of medical event. It seems like it's likely to have been a stroke. He had been on a stream complaining about a pulsing in his temple the day before. He said, "Oh, I'm just a hypochondriac," and then the next day apparently had some sort of major medical event. And people online, not everyone, of course, but what I realized was I couldn't tell the difference between right-wing people who hated Matt Christman and radical leftists who hated him, or supposed people who would self-identify as radical leftists. And it made me realize that in both cases, what we had was an authoritarian left, who were very interested in enforcing, I don't know, a social morality or whatever who were most interested, I think, in punishing people.
Yeah.
And that with that kind of left, we didn't have much of an opportunity to develop an actual politics.
Right.
Especially if you think of politics the way you define it in The Death of the Millennial Left, which is not just politics over policies and how to manage the crisis, which is capitalism, but the politics of the workers struggling for the realization of bourgeois right or socialism.
We could even say that in the realm of capitalist politics, like, is this a struggle over, I mean, it ends up being, but is it self-consciously, deliberately a struggle over the direction of society? Or is it, again, just managing the crisis, and is it just kind of opportunistic power struggles among cliques, among rackets, both within states and between states and, et cetera. So I wanted to say something about this because, so you gave me a heads up about the topic. So I would distinguish between the left and Marxism, actually, in one way. But in another way, of course, I do identify Marxism with the left. So let me explain that. So I do think of the left as an intellectual phenomenon, as an ideological phenomenon, but therefore as an intellectual phenomenon, and as a phenomenon of consciousness. And so there's a lot kind of packed into that. Like, so consciousness could be practice as well as theory. It doesn't have to be like a theoretical position or a theoretical methodology. It can be a practice. And of course, Platypus infamously, and I did coin this expression myself personally, the left is dead, long live the left, meaning that I don't know that I'm the left, right? In other words, I do know that I'm a Marxist, but I don't know that that necessarily means that I'm the left, right? So one of the phenomena that we're dealing with in the world, and this will be in the second volume in my Marxist and Politics, I'm going to include the debate that I had, at least my side of the debate, with Benedict Cryptofash, a kind of anti-left Marxist, or kind of a, post-left Marxist, but an anti-left Marxist, is this idea that, like, Marxism is not the left, is definitely not the left, because there's a kind of colloquial sense of the left, meaning the left wing of capital, the left wing of capitalism, and progressive liberal capitalism, progressive liberalism, the Democrats, right? The normal way that we talk about these things. Now, of course, when I say the left is dead, I mean a socialist left. And therefore, and I do draw on, like, this text that I myself am responsible for raising from obscurity, Leszek Kolakowski's The Concept of the Left. Nobody was talking about this at all. I had not been aware of it. I accidentally discovered it in the New Left Reader. And we put it on the Platypus syllabus in the beginning of the Platypus reading group, early on in 2006. And then people picked up on it, like Bhaskar Sankara and others. Daniel Tutt has become a fan of it as of late as well. And, so I do go with Kolakowski's definition of the left. Where he gets that from is from Marxism, from the history of Marxism, from the idea that there was a left wing of Marxism, that Marxism in its crisis in the 20th century divided between a left and a right. And the right in that context meant Stalinism. Right? And so another way of thinking about it is, if we think about Stalinism as the liquidation of Marxism, but more importantly, because that's like theoretical, practically the liquidation of a proletarian socialist politics, the liquidation of a socialist politics, and a kind of merging into progressive liberalism, right? That progressive liberalism is, of course, a form of conservatism, meaning it's the right. As far as the socialist movement is concerned, not just Marxism, but as far as the socialist movement, like anarchists, are concerned, progressive liberalism is the right. It's the status quo. Right. So again, the idea of that Marxism itself could have accommodated itself to the status quo, could have succumbed to what Kolakowski calls the inertia of the status quo, opportunistically, right? Adapted to the status quo. The Soviet Union becoming what Hillel Tikhtin called a status quo power. Right. So the way people think about it nowadays, they think, oh, well, no, the Soviet Union and today communist China and, maybe communist Cuba, this is the left. And then progressive liberalism is some kind of compromise with leftism, right? Some kind of compromise. So liberals are bad because they compromise between socialism and the right. And progressive liberalism is some kind of mid point between socialism and the capitalist right.
Yeah, and usually people think of the differences as like the difference between a totally state-run economy and some sort of mixed economy with some private
social democracy,
capital.
Market socialism, right? Like a welfare state version of capitalism as being like a midpoint between what we consider to be the right, which would be like free market capitalism, like total individualism, like, I don't know, Ayn Rand type stuff.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And they're like, and then like communist China, maybe not today, but maybe during the Cultural Revolution, right, before the market reforms, and the Soviet Union in the era of Stalin himself, right, like from the first 5-year plan through the death of Stalin, right, as opposed to Khrushchev, who kind of softens things up, and right, and in Eastern Europe you have like kind of goulash communism, you have like some like liberalization and market reforms that go on, right, as a kind of what they called revisionism. There's this anti-revisionist Marxism, that's Marxist-Leninism, it's Orthodox Stalinism, it's Maoism, anti-revisionism. Like, you go to Marxist.org, there's the anti-revisionist library online or something, which is Maoism. And so they use that language, and this is contemporaneous with Kolakowski writing his essay in the late 1950s, from the old revisionist dispute in the pre-World War I Second International.
Right, but they don't, when they talk about anti-revisionism now, they fail to see the degree to which they actually side with the revisionists.
Right, but that's the thing, that's the mindfuck right here, right? So that's the Stalinist, like, that's the problem right there, is that, exactly. And so the idea is, because they'll trot out things like Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder to say, oh, well, you can do this and that, like, you can, be a candidate in the Democratic Party, or you can support the Democratic Party. The Communist Party USA infamously endorsed Hillary instead of Bernie in the recent cycles.
Not at all surprising.
It's not at all surprising in a way. I mean, it's not that they exactly thought that Bernie was ultra-leftist, right? But they did think, that it's most important for the Democrats to win.
Right. It was just
with Hillary.
They're like, we need to make sure that the Democrats have the strongest candidate and will defeat Trump. And Bernie Sanders has a lot of liabilities. And besides, he's not. And then, talking out of both sides of their mouth, he's also not actually a socialist. He's just right?
That's right.
So,
Oh, sure, of course, right? So they do all this, and this is really the history of the 20th century that we're dealing with, and it starts in the 1920s. So it's a good 100 years ago now that you get this weird sophistry about like reading the tea leaves and figuring out what element of capitalist politics is more left versus more right. And this is just a trap, if you will. It's not even a trap, it's a swamp, as to use Lenin's language. It just you just get lost here. And we've been lost for a long time. That's really the point. So, I'm infamously, a Trotskyist, a former Spartacist, and a Frankfurt School guy, and Adorno scholar. And so it's kind of like, oh, why does Trotsky and the Frankfurt School, why do they make people uncomfortable? Because they kind of put their finger on this wound, which is what happened to Marxism in the 1920s and 30s. Right. So what's the problem with Stalinism? What's the issue really? And it's about giving up the horizon of socialist politics, or what Kolakowski called utopia. Now, he didn't mean utopian socialism the way Marx and Engels criticized utopian socialism. He just said the possibility of what isn't the case. In other words, the possibility of something beyond the status quo in the present. Right. So in other words, can you prove that possibility? No, you can't. And yet that sense of possibility must come from somewhere. So it's a very kind of Hegelian idea. It's a very Marx-oriented idea, which is, where does this idea of communism and socialism come from? Well, it must be an actual potentiality within capitalism. That's where the idea comes from. And we might misrecognize it in various ways. But nonetheless, we have an inkling of something.
Right. And I want to point out about Marx's critique of the utopian socialists that he did not critique them for being utopian.
Right.
Right. He critiqued them for failing to understand the categories of capitalism deeply enough to see where they failed in being utopian. He was a
where they fell short.
Right. And he was a critic of socialists, so he critiqued what he thought was probably one of the better.
Yes. He's actually sympathetic. He's actually very sympathetic to the utopian socialists, more sympathetic to them in many respects than to Proudhon.
Right.
Who he thinks is like a Philistine by comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I mean, there is a difference between like the 1820s and 30s, the era of utopian socialism, and the 1840s, where socialism becomes a little bit more hard-bitten. It's in the crisis of the global depression of the 1840s, the Hungry 40s. And he remarks on this. And, so he wants to say, Marx, that we shouldn't like adapt in this way, come down in this way. And also that Proudhon kind of justified his perspective with Hegelianism, actually. And that, I have in the back of my mind, because, postmodernism is still a kind of a thing out there in the world, especially in my academic world, the discontent with Hegel in the 20th century. Why was there a kind of Althusserian, like anti-Hegelian Marxism? Mm-hmm. It's because they detected something in Stalinism where it seemed like, okay, Marxism could become a rationalization of the status quo by saying that the way things are is an expression of historical necessity. And that seemed like a kind of Hegelianism in the sense of the rationality of the actual, right?
Yeah.
That you have to sort of see the rationality of the actual. And so what ends up happening in the 20th century, and this is again goes to the concept of the left and the right, is a kind of recapitulation of the division in Hegelianism between the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians.
I want to bring up Hegel again. Maybe we can talk about it at length in the Parrot Room, because we're reading The Science of Logic with the patrons right now. And right out of the gate, there's kind of a dispute. I want to say I love Slavoj Žižek. I like him too, but I got the Žižekian in there, who is like not reading the text. But, but
right.
Jumping ahead, he's reading the text. He's reading the text, but he's like,
right.
He's interpreting it too quickly, and we can talk about that, at least in my opinion.
Right.
And we can talk about that issue in the parrot room, but because I do think it is important to see how Hegel was a philosopher of freedom.
Absolutely.
You know, and
that Hegel himself is not a right Hegelian.
Right. No, he's not.
Right. So that's the tricky part. Although he's also not a Marxist. He's not Marx.
No.
And he's also not like a young Hegelian. I mean, the way that I like to parse this out. So it's not really left and right Hegelians. It's more young Hegelians and old Hegelians.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, the only left Hegelians are Marx and Engels themselves. Right. So in other words, what makes them different from the other young Hegelians? Mm-hmm. And also their criticism of the young Hegelians is not just methodological or philosophical, but really political. Meaning
Mm-hmm.
there's a kind of spurious radicalism to the young Hegelians that Marx and Engels are very keen to point out.
Right.
That they think of themselves as more radical than they actually are, and that they're actually conceding to German realities in a way that they're not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so in that sense, you know, they are adapting, they are right wing in their own way, and especially like in their materialism, right? Because they are like socialists and communists, the young Hegelians. And they are kind of trying to materialize Hegel in the way that, again, a kind of vulgar Marxism thinks that Marx is just materializing Hegel. And it's like, no, the young Hegelians did that, and Marx criticized them for it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So to bring it back to the Kolakowski, the issue is the left as an idea, right? The idealist dimension of Marxism, which is this, again, goes back to Kant, goes back to Hegel, goes back to German idealism, goes back to the sense that actually the idea of something that doesn't exist is still rooted in historical reality. It's still an expression of a historical potential that you can't point to empirically, but is nonetheless real.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that, again, it's kind of like, so, you know, in terms of today, right? The fact that socialism is being redefined as progressive liberal capitalism, and, you know, and people might have their choice of flavors of that, like, in other words, the Chinese model, or, you know, what have you, the Western European, the Nordic country model, or what have you. You know, it doesn't change the fact that that's what it is. And, you know, and that's where you get into like state capitalism and all this stuff. And people turn it into like empirical descriptive matters of, well, does it fit these criteria of, you know, analysis? And it's like, well, no, the point is politics, and the point is historical possibility. And so the problem with collapsing the distinction between a kind of progressive liberal capitalism and socialism is that you are abandoning that horizon of socialism, that task that appears to be utopian, right? So in other words, if you really press people on it, mm-hmm. what they object to is the utopianism, what they reject is the idealism. And it's like, well, but to be a revolutionary is idealistic, both in the colloquial sense and also in the philosophical, you know, German idealist sense of you're pursuing something that's only a potential and a possibility. You're not acting on the basis of what exists.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And they lose that, and they're just like, well, no, we want to be, you know, materially grounded, and we want to convince people that it's really possible. And so we have to like point to empirical phenomena now that show the possibility of socialism. And it's like, well, what we really have, because, you know, Marx and Engels were good Hegelians. They don't have blueprints of the future. What that means is that they're aware of the fact that the struggle for socialism might be misrecognizing itself now. In other words, that basically the only thing that they thought was tangibly possible that they could really point to, and not even point to as like an empirical fact, but like as the next step in the chain, the next link in the chain, to use the kind of Lukács expression, is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Meaning that's the thing that, you know, is in a sense unproven and yet more practically like immediate in its task.
And they could point to it because it was it hadn't been established, but there was a struggle for political power from the working class that was going on.
That's right.
At the time.
That's right.
So they could point to that. But what you could also point to now, now that that's not around, is you could point to contradictions in society. You could say, look, we just had a moment where we had too much milk, so we dumped a bunch of it down the drain in order to bring the prices of milk back up. So doesn't that show that there's a potential for the milk to be abundantly available? Or, we have cars, we have all these cars, and many of them are just sitting in warehouses. So
that's distribution, of course, right? So
right.
That. So it's like kind of like we could distribute things better than we do now. That's always possible. And then, of course, the right-wing economists are there to say, oh, but if you do that, it will collapse the economy. And of course, they're right about that.
No. It's important to say, you can't just say, oh, well, a good manager would overcome that problem. But rather,
or find new markets, or find a new way for the state to correct the market.
Right. No, but these things were rational. The way the warehouses full of cars is better in this system than getting them all out there. Right. That actually is the right choice given our conditions of possibility right now. But
and given what the actual necessity is. Right. So the necessity is not the use values of people.
No.
The necessity is capital accumulation, the possibility of a future society, basically, in capitalist terms. And, again, that we don't collapse this very fragile exchange system, international exchange system that we have that keeps things going and ultimately does provide the use values. Right. And so it's super tricky because, again, we're immediately talking at a level of abstraction that, people lose patience with. And so, look, in our time, the time of the Millennial left, right? So basically, I came out of retirement with the Millennial left. You got turned on to Marxism in the moment of the Millennial left around the 2008 crisis. And, what did we see? We saw billionaires, and we saw the 1% and the 99%. And we saw fabulous profits being made by corporations while the rest of the population went through a structural adjustment in their standard of living. And that's still ongoing. Still ongoing today, right? So the UAW strike is about that, right? It's not about the profitability of these corporations. It's about losing pace with the standard of living for the workers. Right. And so it looks like, oh, the problem is the rich people. The problem is socioeconomic inequality. Right. It looks like that's the problem. And it's like, hold on, children. That's not the problem.
Right.
And then
in the case of did you see or I talked about the UAW strike on Monday.
Yeah.
And one of the things I pointed out was, while it's true that this year profits are way up, and if you just look at this year in a snapshot, certainly possible that in this year they could well afford to pay the workers, a lot more, and they should demand that. But
long term,
but the long term trend is a decline, and has been for 50 years, and there's no reason to think that this current.
So you ready for this, Doug? Because it is built into the UAW's own perspective, by the way. And they've been doing this for a long time, through the whole neoliberal era, which is that you get a 40% pay raise, but you agree to slash the workforce.
Well, yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
Right. It's
kind of like, all right. Of course, they can afford to pay much fewer.
But it's not going to happen. This isn't going to happen. But one of their demands was a job bank, where the idea was that the workers who were let go from certain parts of the company's, production would be reserved, retrained, and then put to work in another part of the company. And the whole idea is that we're transitioning to electric cars. We're going to, so that,
they want some control over the process. Right.
Right. Well, because even
of labor, of the
even
surplus,
if
the reserve army.
Even if we go green in auto manufacturing, that will entail fewer workers.
By the way, that's okay. In other words, if the unions want some control over like managing the reserve army of labor. Because if I understand things correctly, part of the phenomenon with manufacturing, and I guess Saurabh Amari talks about this, right? Casualization of labor doesn't just mean the gig economy. It also means like variable hours. In other words, you're an employee and you're on call as needed.
Yeah, that happens a lot. That's been happening a lot for a long time.
And that's in the manufacturing sector as well, and it's in the unionized sector as well.
That is I didn't know that union jobs would allow that shit to go on. You know,
of course, because it's the price they have to pay to keep the jobs at all. Yeah. Right. So the question there is, and this is where, you know, your more sophisticated social democrats will come in, and, you know, or democratic socialists, whatever, DSAers. And, you know, again, it's co-management. In other words, that the union has an ability to assert a role in the decisions that are made on such things. And, you know, one could say, well, that's good, right? In other words, like the point of class struggle, just at a basic level, at a liberal level, not in a socialistic way whatsoever, is to enhance the social and potentially political power of the working class, like collective bargaining, right? So what you want to do is put the workers in a position of stronger collective bargaining. In other words, you do want the unions to play more of a role over conditions of hiring and firing and over management decisions.
Yeah, right? But there are such severe limits to that. I worked a job where the manager would interview people when he was hiring, he would interview people, he'd bring them in, have them work with us for a day. Then when that person left, he would ask us our opinion and we get the vote on who got hired and who
well, that's a really lame version of it. It's much more intense than that. In other words, it's much more developed than that. And, you know, if you look
the point was not just that, but it was also like that was kind of shitty. But overall, you're only going to be presented choices that the management want you to be presented with, because the manager is only going to look at choices that are realistic within the what is in that moment. There's never going to be a path towards more empowerment for the workers really that way. This is a kind of a show of participation. It's real participation.
Oh, well, certainly that is. What I'm thinking, though, is like your social democratic parties who are able to play a role both at the level of the corporate firms and over the labor market, but also over capitalist state policy, right? As like political parties in a parliamentary democratic representational system, and might even have, I always like to point out that there are still workers' councils in Germany today that descend from the 1918 revolution. And they are like a state kind of body. And, you know, they co-manage capitalism, not just at the level of the corporate firm or collective bargaining, but at the level of state policy. And again, conditions for the labor market. And so, again, the problem that Marxism puts on the table, and again, why it seems to be immediately off in the stratosphere and, you know, utopian and idealistic and abstract and purism and all this stuff, is that that's not where the problem is. In other words, the problem is in the long-term prognosis of society. Meaning there's a lot of room for this kind of stuff in capitalism. There actually is. I mean, again, we're conditioned by the neoliberal era. You know, with the TINA, there is no alternative. The idea that this is just what has to be done, and so we have to tear all these things down that have been built up in the preceding historical era because they're all impediments to, you know, exigent necessities right now. And, you know, this is like market reforms or shock treatment. You know, I mean, obviously shock treatment didn't really happen in the metropolitan countries, but some version of it did. You know, we associate that more with the developing world. But you could say, you know, the United States, Britain, even Western Europe was subject to some kind of a shock treatment in the neoliberal era to get the economy, you know, going again. So that's where the action is. And what's interesting is that in terms of like ancient history now, the history of Marxism, like again, what I was saying about the left and the right of Marxism, is that under very dire conditions, Marxists were thrust into a position where they had to say, are we going to risk revolution? This is a risk, it's a gamble. Or are we going to be responsible political actors and save society from utter collapse? because that's what the SPD did in Germany.
Mhm.
Right? That's why they put down Rosa Luxemburg and her party. Not because they didn't want socialism, but because, and not even because they had given up on the idea of it or even the utopian possibility of it. It's that they were like, under these conditions right now, we can't afford this, right? Society's falling apart right now. And, you know, the Allies are ready to invade and the crazy right-wingers are ready to take over, and there can be an utter collapse of the economy, right? Like all these like immediate pressing dangers. It's like,
Right.
yeah, we're Marxists, yeah, we're socialists, but right now we have to do this.
Right.
Right? And, you know, so we have to understand the rationality of that, right? So that even when the largest, proportionally speaking, mass socialist party took power, it was under conditions where they felt that they couldn't pursue socialism, or they could only pursue socialism by way of preserving society as much as they possibly could, which is, of course, understandable. And even that's a good, you know, that's a well-reasoned argument. Meaning, I think that people have this like picture of like, I don't know, war communism and the Russian Revolution and early Soviet Union, where they like that radicalism that was forced upon the Bolsheviks.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know exactly what to make of the new economic policy of that era. And then, of course, they ultimately do think that it was somehow necessary to do the 5-year plan and the crash industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture and all that stuff, right? And, you know, it's kind of like, well, wait a second. You know, we are, as socialists, interested in transforming the realm of necessity and not just doing what is necessary and calling that historical materialism and therefore justified by Marxism, right? I think people have a very hard time thinking about that. Thinking about, like, from like a Frankfurt School perspective, everything that happened, World War I, the SPD taking power in the Weimar era, the Soviet Union and its history in the 20s and 30s, in a fundamental way, all of that was unnecessary. Like actual, concrete, empirical, living, breathing human history was unnecessary. That doesn't jibe well with people in their common sense. They really don't like that.
Yeah.
Right? And so to stand for the possibility of something, you know, it's called counterfactual history, whatever it's called. It's, you know, there are all these sort of trash categories that people can dismiss it with. But fundamentally, right, to say, okay, it became a cascading series of accommodations.
Right.
To what appear to be exigent, emergency, dire, unavoidable historical necessities.
Right.
Right? And again, Marxism, there is a way that Marxism can be taken to justify that. Again, as historical materialist analysis. And right? And so, and then, you know, the only alternative to that is idealistic, is utopian. And that's what Kolakowski was saying about Stalinism. He's like, well, look, you know, Stalinism became the right. Right? And that's hard for people to understand now, because they're just like, oh, wait, radical egalitarianism and just distribution and re-educating, or if necessary, killing off the utter reactionary fascists. How can that be right-wing?
Right.
Well, because it's ultimately the verdict in 2023 is that it all was part of the preservation of capitalism at a world historical level. It all was part of that story.
Even though the fascist project was also to preserve capitalism.
I mean, in some ways, the fascists were more dishonest than the Stalinists, right? Because they were whacked out on, like, I don't know what, returning Germany to pre-Aryan tribal something. You know, they wanted to reestablish some ecological balance with the land and all this stuff, and, you know, and just set up like mechanical armaments on the frontiers to keep all the bad, you know, liberal democratic capitalists out. You know, like, and so, you know, in some ways, of course, the Stalinists had the advantage of having a veneer of rationality to what they were doing. Whereas the fascists could say, fuck rationality, this is like life. This is like the life of the German people. This is like some kind of, don't try to rationalize it because that's how the bourgeoisie hoodwinks us or something.
Why is it that, well, I guess there's a couple ways for me to ask this question. I'm going to try the first impulse, which I think might be the wrong way, but why is it so difficult to overcome the decisions that were made by those who came before you?
Struggle continues, Doug. The struggle continues.
Yeah.
What are you, against the struggle?
No, but I mean, I know, like, look, I used to be moved by that slogan, which came out of 68, right? And that was one place where it came out of. It was, it's like, we're not totally defeated. We could go back to this moment where the
people united will never be defeated. I used to go to demos and I used to sing it with everybody else, except I did my own substitution that nobody heard.
Yeah.
The people united will always be defeated.
Yeah. Right.
Right? Like, that's what we've seen. Like, in other words, if you really want to know what the historical verdict on that is, the people united will always be defeated.
Right. But God. Well, it depends on how they're united, and also it's not the people, it's the
people and the united. Exactly. How are the people united? Fuck.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, so why is it that, okay, when you say, well, the struggle continues, Doug, don't you want the struggle to continue? Are you against the struggle? Are you against the movement? Well, that makes it sound like it's social pressure that's making it difficult.
No, I mean, obviously I've been targeted by this as well.
Right.
And so I'm speaking from experience, which is that, and it goes back to Trotsky, right? He's the, traitor. He's the fascist wrecker. He must be, even if he doesn't himself know it, he's working for the Gestapo and the Mikado and whatever, right? And he's the social fascist, Trotskyist wreckers, right? All the problems in the Soviet Union are because people are, lackadaisical and not enthusiastic enough about the 5-year plans, and so they must be killed, right? Because unbeknownst to themselves, they're doing this. And of course, the Frankfurt School, in absenting themselves from the struggle, right, and becoming pessimistic about the working class, they became traitors, right? And Gabriel Rockhill and others are out there to say, you're a traitor. Chris Cutrone, you're a Trotskyist, Frankfurt School, you're in the long line of traitors. And, my attitude is just very simple. And this goes to the leftist ed. The struggle doesn't continue. It doesn't, right? Not the struggle I'm interested in. That struggle ended a long time ago. And yes, people are still struggling, but that's not the point, because actually capitalism is based on that. Capitalism is based on constant revolutionizing of production. And how do people think that happens? Do they think that it's like in Steve Jobs's or Bill Gates's like garage? That's where the revolution of the revolution of capitalism happens on the street. The working class does the revolution of capitalism. That's at least what Marx thought. He thought the Industrial Revolution was not like a conspiracy of the capitalists against the workers to use the machines against the workers. The workers' own class struggle created the conditions under which it became possible and necessary to choose to invest in machines rather than hire workers.
So I wanted to ask that same question I asked before, but in a different way that might be more clarifying, maybe not. But if we suppose that the choices made in the early 20th century, say in Germany with the SPD, and that the choice to put down Rosa Luxemburg, stop the revolution, make an accommodation to capital, was done out of a sense of necessity, and that it was the choice that the people made, that enough workers supported, that there was a power behind it to hold, and they politically won, even though they lost the socialism in the process. They have
majority working class support.
Yeah. they had the might to enact their will.
And the inertia too, not just the might, but the inertia.
So that's what happened then, and the conditions for revolution were much better. In other words, the workers were more organized. There was a socialist left, that, you know, enough people who were part of the socialist left that this could be discussed openly. The amount
and
of
they had a pretty sophisticated Marxism. In other words, we can criticize it, but we have to acknowledge that perhaps in their moment, their Marxism was far more sophisticated than anything that we have now.
Well, I would definitely agree with that, even though I have critiques from.
Right, but they were politically engaged. In other words, there were things motivating their questions that gave it like a traction on reality and a kind of a substance.
Right.
That our Marxism has to be necessarily more abstract.
So, given that is the case, how can we justify the risk of attempting to do better under worse conditions, and including not being as adequately trained or not having the full understanding that they had in the past today? Like, what makes a Marxist today think it's worthwhile to try to pick up the struggle to continue it, and rather than just continue the struggle that is capitalism itself?
Right.
How and this goes to like, can we win? Is it even, or, you know, can we win? Is it even can we conceive of winning? You
know, Slavoj Žižek, so it's, you know, his thing is to fail but fail better.
Yeah.
Right. Struggle and fail but fail better. So he's got like that thing, and so that immediately came to mind. So winning. Okay. So, you know, Charlie Sheen, we're winning, right? Right. So
I got tiger's blood. I'm a winner. I win.
Yeah, very Gen X, very, very lame middle-aged man kind of sentiment, you know. But so, okay, so I mentioned earlier that I'm not sure, like I'm pretty sure that I'm the last Marxist or something approximate to that. But
we are. You said at the beginning, and we are.
Well,
you,
right.
Me with my "I'm still with her" shirt.
With Rosa, hopefully.
Yeah.
But okay, so but I'm not sure that's necessarily the left in the sense that I mean, like not in the sense of the Democrats and progressive liberal capitalism, but in the sense of a real potential movement of history, a real historical possibility, right? So I've said this in, you know, in our conversations previously. I'm actually open to post-Marxism. I am. I just think that it would have to be, you know, authentic, legit, like not spurious post-Marxism. In other words, actually goes beyond Marxism rather than skirting Marxism or avoiding it. And that's what I've seen in the last 100 years. All attempts at post-Marxism have actually been an avoidance of it. And so, again, I'm not sure that Marxism is adequate today to express the possibility beyond our historical moments in capitalism, or in whatever you want to call it, right? So, you know, I'm like, you know, like techno, like feudalism or whatever, you know, I'm like, okay, I roll my eyes at this stuff, but I'm also like, well, they could of course be right about that, you know, that it's no longer capitalism. I mean, you know, it's plausible. In other words, I have to treat it at the level of, I can't take my own Marxism for granted.
Right.
It's truth, right? I can't take that for granted. And so, you know, for me, again, the question is, I think that we haven't surpassed the horizon of historical Marxism. I think that historical Marxism, like, did grasp a horizon of possibility that we have not surpassed. Right. And so I do think that what we've had is not really post-Marxism, or, you know, we haven't transcended Marxism, but we've fallen below it. And not only in the Marxist realm itself, like the kind of vulgar Marxism or the kind of self-liquidation of Marxism, whatever you want to call it, but also attempts to get beyond Marxism have also fallen below it. And have usually, like, they haven't even gotten beyond the vulgar Marxism that they took to be Marxism, that they wanted to overthrow or surpass. Right. So that's the thing. And so, okay, so you went to contradiction earlier, right? In other words, that we can at least grasp contradiction. Well, maybe, But that's a controversial point too, because what do we mean by contradiction? And do contradictions point beyond themselves? Is a dialectical approach to contradiction warranted, justified? Right? It's hard to just say, oh, well, if you find contradiction, then you are finding a historical possibility beyond the present. Of course, that's a very Hegelian thing. And who's a Hegelian, right? And so, what's the possibility of being Hegelian in the present moment? Because again, what I have in mind, and again, this is the Frankfurt School part, but it's also maybe the esoteric Marxist part, is that movement through dialectical contradiction describes the movement of capitalism itself. Right. And so there is a kind of a goal beyond the dialectic, we might say. There is a goal beyond this kind of totality of contradiction. In other words, that this is what's to be overcome. And so again, what we're grasping there is not necessarily freedom, but we're grasping unfreedom when we're looking at contradiction. Right. And that's why we can't, we're dealing with much, in a sense, grosser or a more obtuse phenomena today. I mean, that's why it's natural for us to reach to.
Give me an example of the kind of phenomenon that we're dealing with today that we might be able to get a grip on dialectically, but that wouldn't necessarily point us
beyond
freedom.
Capitalism.
Right.
And wouldn't necessarily be the grasping of freedom, but more a grasping of unfreedom. Well, what you mentioned about like distribution problems.
Right.
Like things that seem amenable to policy reform, but for the fact that there isn't like an actual political constituency to do it.
Right.
So I know that this always annoys you when I point to Thomas Piketty. And like maybe this is a more adequate description of what's going on than what Marxism described historically. And you're like, oh no, I don't want to grant that. And it's like, well, no, the problem with Piketty is not at that level. It's more at the level of everybody could read Thomas Piketty, all the capitalists, like the Davos people or the Bilderberg people could read Thomas Piketty, and they could all say, yeah, this is true. But there's no way to act on it. Right. So that's the real problem with it. Because
why isn't there a way to act? I mean, just to be clear, what he was suggesting was that this is very mainstream, progressive opinion. We institute massive taxation on the wealthiest people. And I'm not sure if he had anything built in about job guarantees. But also because
I don't
through
think
that
necessarily, right.
Right. But the idea was through that massive taxation, you could then supplement wages and undo the inequality that's emerged through neoliberal policies, which would, he said, create more stable conditions and overcome the crisis that like
the kind of financial crash, right?
Yeah, because he had this. If I'm remembering correctly, he had this sort of a theory of capitalism. That the reason it went into crisis was because of underconsumption. The wages weren't distributed well enough so that you could create adequate demand for the products that were being produced. Therefore, production became less profitable. You got financialization, blah blah blah.
Yeah, over financialization, right?
So through redistribution of the wealth as money in a kind of wage from the state, you could overcome both the economic crisis and the inequality in society.
That's right.
That's
so,
what he
I mean,
was saying.
in some ways, a lot of the discontent with the financial crisis amounted to, and you see this, it's not the same, but a parallel phenomenon with MMT, with modern monetary theory, is the attempt to reestablish the true value of money. Right. And so it is a variety of monetarism. And by the way, so I was invited to write a review of the latest Milton Friedman biography by Jennifer Burns for Compact magazine. And so I'm embarking upon that task now. And what's missing from that book is the phrase "we're all Keynesians now" that Milton Friedman uttered in the late 60s, I think. And so that's missing because, of course, the whole setup is that you're either a Keynesian or you're a Friedmanite, rather than seeing that actually, monetarism isn't this other thing that Keynesianism is a variety of monetarism. And of course, that was MMT.
Right.
In other words, that the problem is money supply and, regulating that adequately. And the problem with financialization or credit bubbles, right, is that money has lost its value. So interestingly, even though everyone is denying the labor theory of value, they're also acknowledging it at some level.
Right. Yeah. But in fact, right. I could go into why I don't believe it's even the case that money loses its value in these moments of crisis. Exactly. It's an adequate reflection of the ability of work to produce value in a profitable way. It's not, is how I would think of it. It's
a capital
like,
crisis. It's a capital crisis, not a money crisis. It's a capital crisis.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And it ultimately comes down to the way that efficient labor contradicts itself.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the long historical view, though, right? So, but what I'm saying is that in the moment now, as politics is configured, right? Like Syriza.
Yeah, this is what I was going to ask you. It's like the fact that I think it would fail, this Thomas Piketty approach, I have a Marxist critique of it, doesn't mean that it can't be taken up and tried out, right?
Right. Because
I would have said the neoliberal approach would fail, and I would have been right in the long term.
Right, but you would have been wrong for a good 50 years, right?
Yeah.
So, which matters a lot in the realm of politics.
Right.
So my attitude, of course, is don't count any of this shit out.
Right.
Right. And so, again, what does it mean to say that it will fail? And again, we can't be like, oh, well,
one thing it means is that the discontent in society will not be overcome. Not even in the short term. It might be adequately overcome for people who institute the policies to maintain power, but it won't be overcome. And that's
all that matters, by the way.
Yeah, right.
That's all that matters, right? So I was watching an interview with this guy, Douglas McGregor, who's a retired colonel who was a hero in the Gulf War from our days gone by.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And is like a tank warfare specialist or something. So he's become a commentator. He was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson. So he's a commentator on the Ukraine war.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that he ventured into the realm of social policy and politics. And he was like, Americans are being asked to sacrifice this and that while their standard of living is going down and X, Y, and Z. And he says, the United States is headed to come to Jesus moment. And who knows what that's going to be, right? But he saw the Ukraine war as a symptom of that, right? So even like a total just military, technocratic, like military technique, tactical kind of guy, right? He's just like, look, the U.S. policy can't win in Ukraine against Russia and these weapons that we're using and the Ukrainians. And, he's just saying militarily, this can't work. But then it was like, and the United States is going to hit a wall, right? And this is a symptom of that, right? And, and the elites are whatever, right? So he has some kind of potted, I'm sure, vision of politics and whatever. But it seemed very far afield from what they were talking about. And yet it went to that place. Namely, there's going to be a major political crisis in the United States.
Right.
Right. And, you can see in something as obscure as the Ukraine war policy and its folly, you can see already.
Yeah, I know. I am worried about it, and not in a good way. Like, I need to be worried about it in a good way, like a Marxist would be, like a utopian, rather than the way I get worried about it, like, oh no, it could be me next or something like that.
Right. No, so you gotta think about it in terms of, okay, so what would a come to Jesus moment in the United States mean? Well, I mean, it could mean a lot of chaos and violence and this kind of thing. But it would also
wait, before we go into that, I want to return to Piketty for just a second. When you say Piketty doesn't have the political, there's no way to enact it politically, you just mean that for whatever reason within the Democratic Party or civil society or the Republican Party, there isn't a base for that transformation. And when I talked to Bhaskar Sankara, I keep going back to this. It was a very brief exchange after the Sohrab Bhaskar moment, where they were discussing how they both love different kinds of labor policies. I said, so is this what's happened to the democratic socialism, to the DSA, that we're handing it off to the Republicans? And he said, no, SORAP doesn't have a base.
Right.
And of course, the first thought I had was, well, turns out we didn't either, right? But I suppose what
it in a couple of different senses, I'm sure. So there's base in terms of an electorate, a voting base,
right,
and then there's a base in terms of a social base, right? And that's where the DSA kind of does square the circle, if you will, because they ostensibly are for both. They're for both, for building up an electoral base and building up a social base.
Well, where would they point to show to demonstrate that they're building up a social base?
Oh, labor militancy, right? So the UAW strike would be
but that's not different from the voting base. That is the same.
Well, it's not necessarily the same because, again, if you strengthen the labor unions, then you have something to hold. What Sorab called countervailing power, to hold the politicians accountable. Because obviously the politicians
through threatening their voter base.
But more than that, right? More than that. You have to be able to take extra parliamentary action too, right? You have to be able to change conditions on the ground also to push policy reforms. It's not enough to just say, we'll be more or less enthusiastic about voting for you. That's not enough, actually.
So when the Black Lives Matter protests, that was the Democrats exerting power through their social base.
I mean, it was a protest, meaning it was a protest against, these abuses going on under Democratic administration, like at a municipal level, at a state.
No, I'm talking about in 2020.
No, I know. And then because, I always like to say it's because there was a prospect of the Democrats winning presidential office. But with it being Biden and Kamala Harris, with it being the author of the crime bill in the 90s, and with a prosecutor, right? That was her thing before she was a senator. Her claim to fame was being a rather draconian prosecutor. That they were like, it was a real cry of protest before accommodation, meaning it really was like a kind of despair of like, okay, this shit didn't go away under Obama. Certainly didn't go away under Trump. Is it ever going to go away? And, we want to let the Democrats know that we're unhappy with the fact that...
having a social base means that the people who are acting in your interest have to know it.
They do. I mean, I don't think that it was about threatening to withhold votes because it was all in blue areas that we're not going to elect Republicans if blacks didn't vote. That wasn't going to happen. Right? In Illinois or Seattle or Portland.
Well, right. It was right. But what happened was those protests gave credence to the idea that Trump was an extraordinarily dangerous president. There we go. And that there was a need for a return to normal. There was a need for
but also a fear of returning to normal if it just meant what Obama did. Right?
I don't think so. Chris, I don't think so. I remember the protesters that organized people around Black Lives Matter, many of them saying, now they were Democratic operatives, they're saying this demonstrates the power of the vote. This demonstrates why we need to. We're taking the power from the streets back to the voting booths. And a lot of the people who were most active around BLM protests became Democratic Party operatives, and certainly most of them became Democratic Party voters.
The expansion of the squad also in the 2022 election, and then the 2020 election.
I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I don't see. I'm not saying that the original riot after the murder of George Floyd was the social base, but the way it was taken up opportunistically and transformed,
But again, where are the reforms, right? So again, it's one of these things where, I mean, I like to point at rather the opposite, which is before the George Floyd protests, where was Black Lives Matter? It was non-existent, meaning it was gone under Trump, and then came back only in 2020, and only fairly late in the election cycle. It was after COVID, right? It was when Biden and Harris were ascending to the nomination. And my point is that why was there no Black Lives Matter protests under Trump?
Because they didn't think that he could be pressured by...
Right. They knew that they had no audience, right? And so what does it mean to pressure the Democrats, right? I mean, it's just, that's why it's not even I would say it's not a social base. It's not an electoral base. It's not a social base. It's something that, okay, our generation, we talk about this, like growing up in the shadow of the 60s and what that means. Because the change that happened, you could say it happened in the 80s and 90s, but really you have to look back at the 60s. And Vietnam anti-war protests did not stop the war.
Everyone loves to say that.
But they just obviously did not. Meaning it only, the National Guard shot down people under Nixon. In other words, it wasn't up and up by any means. And anyway, Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam. So that, and the black militancy of the Black Power turn of the Panthers, right, for example, or more general Black Power, Stokely Carmichael, accomplished absolutely nothing. So what did accomplish things? I think that we just recently celebrated the anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, right? The March for Freedom and Jobs, right? The bad way of interpreting this is that the civil rights movement was just a big protest demo. It wasn't. It was a real movement. Like on the ground, it actually did change conditions in the South. Now, they didn't have success in the North, right, famously. But in the South, they actually had a great deal of success. And it wasn't just Supreme Court decisions and law changes. It was actual conditions on the ground. They did change conditions on the ground. They made enforcement of segregation impossible on the ground, right? And they didn't force white people into submission or anything like that. What they did was they made the absurdity of segregation apparent because it had already outlived its time. It was already over, right? There was already an integrated working class. There was already an industrialized South coming out of World War II and even earlier. And so it was a real movement in a way that we have not seen, and in a way that the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement, was not real the way the civil rights movement was real. Right? And so instead it becomes, the civil rights legislation and this and that, and the assassination of Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers, it gets very muddled. And so I think that what we've inherited all the way down to the present, although there was a moment in the millennial left where they knew they needed something else, is this idea that a social movement is basically a big protest demo. I used to joke that people thought that the Russian Revolution was a huge demonstration with guns. That's what they thought revolution was. Revolution is a lot of people on the street with guns. It's that's not a fucking revolution. Do you know, what are we talking about? So
an insurrection is a bunch of people showing up and breaking windows.
Right.
I
know. Right, exactly. That's an insurrection. And so I just feel like, okay, people have no idea, really. Because even short of a revolution, even a political revolution, just overthrowing a regime or a government, like the Arab Spring type stuff.
Yeah.
Even short of that, right, there is this idea that being a revolutionary is screaming very loudly or taking an extreme position, right, or adopting the most...
Okay, so let's talk about the Arab Spring in Egypt. What you saw was that the squares filled up with protesters. They refused to go home. They fought with the police. They were beaten and injured and killed, and they kept coming. And they kept coming. Why was that not just a huge protest that went for days and riots that went for days and days? What made that into a political revolution that got rid of Mubarak? What?
Well, there wasn't. I would say, okay, so I'm like a very strict Marxist, right? So I've got
Okay.
my strict criteria here. I got my checklist.
Mm-hmm.
It was a regime change.
Right.
Okay, so what would
So you just mentioned the kind of political revolution that just
Right.
ends up with the regime change.
Right. But,
So that's what I'm saying
right.
Mubarak was. So what
why
made
did they
that
get rid of Mubarak?
not just a protest
Right.
with guns?
So because the military in Egypt decided that Mubarak was a liability, so they got rid of him.
What made them decide that he was a liability?
Oh, because the protests and the demonstration and the kind of social chaos had made things ungovernable in a real way.
Right.
But I think that
so everyone running into the streets with guns, protesting for weeks at a time, nonstop, creating civil disruption can be revolutionary.
Well, it can be. I would not call it revolutionary because, again, it didn't really democratize the Egyptian state.
Okay,
right?
But it was a kind of revolution that the political, in the sense of regime change, that can happen through.
Yeah, regime change. You can definitely overthrow a government. You can get rid of a president.
Right.
Through.
So what?
Right.
So to make it a socialist revolution, what else do you need besides civil unrest and make things ungovernable?
You need to actually be able to replace the existing state with something else. That's a political revolution. That's not even a social revolution. A political revolution means smashing the state, the existing state. So because what happened in Egypt, it's not that because what was the political agency there? It was the Muslim Brotherhood. It was the Islamic fundamentalists. And they did take office briefly through election.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't divide the Egyptian military. They didn't replace the state, right? They were just put in as figureheads, and they were disposed of as quickly as possible and treated very brutally, by the way, right? Morsi, who was elected, then ended up dying in prison, right?
Yeah. So I'm beginning to say, I understand everything you're saying, but go back to Bhaskar, when he says Sohrab doesn't have a social base, he's not talking about
Muslim Brotherhood has a base. So that's my point there. Muslim Brotherhood actually had a base, and yet they were not even able to.
What he means is there weren't enough people who could, within the sphere of the Republicans, and that could mean independent voters, that could mean non-voters who are just workers, to cause enough disruption for the Republicans to be forced to change their way of managing or to replace the current spate of Republicans.
Right. I mean, I think that a few years earlier, maybe Bhaskar would have said that, this perspective does have a base. I mean, it's a funny thing. So using Sohrab Ahmari as an example is tricky because he was a Trumpist who's now not a Trumpist. Right. And he's not only not a Trumpist, but he's also not even a Republican necessarily, right? He's been Biden-pilled. And as he said at our event, he said that he recognizes that the Democratic Party is the party of responsible government, and the Republicans are not. So that seems to me like he's just going to the Democrats, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, it's kind of like, well, could you have some kind of centrist, quasi, social democracy, some kind of extreme right-wing social democracy, meaning from the right wing of the Democratic Party, right? Could you have this? Could you, so in other words, I'm not sure what Bhaskar had in mind exactly, but I have a feeling that he had a few things in mind at the same time. Mm-hmm. At the most substantial level, it was Bhaskar's acknowledgement that there isn't a base for this in the Democratic Party either.
Right.
Because he has to acknowledge that. In other words, he has to acknowledge the aspirational quality of the DSA project.
Right. Yeah.
The rank and file strategy, what have you, right?
I think what he meant, I think in the moment, casually, he wasn't sitting there on a panel. He wasn't giving me, we've been drinking wine.
Be the most honest.
Right. I'm sure it was, but I think what he meant. And
he's talking to you, so he knows where you're coming from.
Right. That's true. I think what he meant was Sohrab's not going to be able to change the character of the Republican Party. He's That's what he meant.
Because, you know, Bhaskar is saying we can't change the character of the Democratic Party, so how the fuck could
but he's not saying that, because both Sohrab and Bhaskar are saying Biden's already the change. Biden is already the change.
What was it that Bhaskar said not that long ago? He said something like, Biden is the most progressive president of his lifetime, and how miserable it is to say that. In other words, how little one is saying when one is saying that.
Right.
Right. Right. So in other words, it's
my feeling is Biden's the worst president I've ever experienced in my lifetime, and the second in line now would be George W. Bush. Like Biden is worse. And my criteria is pretty simple. It's like we're involved in a proxy war in Ukraine that could blow up the world.
Which criteria? Yeah.
And, you know, we are facing the overturning, and they're instituting the next step, continuing Bush's Patriot Act war on terror and turning it into a mechanism of control of the domestic population in the West in general. So those two things combined.
Bad things happening, or worse in terms of incompetence?
Oh, I'm not. An incompetent president isn't necessarily going to be that bad.
Right.
I mean, like
exactly. Like Trump was incompetent in many ways, but he wasn't doing as many bad things.
Right. Yeah. Like, no, it's worse in terms of creating worse conditions for socialism. For sure.
So I see.
And then,
right.
You know, and also and by that, I don't even mean something like, oh, my particular pet project, just like we are losing our mobility and freedom and what I take to make life kind of comfortable and good, even in these conditions.
I mean, we are still in a crisis, right? And so we had the 2008 crisis that never quite resolved, although it was the case that there was already kind of recovery, and it was going on under Obama, but it really did flower under Trump before.
Yeah, no, right. It only took, what, 8 years for there to be
that's about right.
a partial recovery from, and, you know, after throwing, you know, to fully move it from the level of civil society into the state took 8 years.
Right.
You know, is how I think
to fully register it. Even though we can't forget that Obama was supposedly elected on the economic crisis too.
Well, of course he was. Yeah.
And Trump was also.
Trump was. Yeah, I don't know. Trump was elected because of the failure. No, but yeah, Brexit and Trump were both responses to the.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. They definitely were. Right. And there is this kind of delay. There is this kind of lag. And so we've had the COVID shock. And we've also had a kind of a semi-recovery under Biden, but it's a miserable recovery. And we've got these other phenomena like inflation. And, you know, which long-term might be some kind of adjustment, you know, some kind of necessary adjustment. Who knows? You know, it's unclear, I would say. So, but again, so we are in this place. So getting back to the question of like the left per se, is that I think that just very spontaneously, most people, most of our listeners, most of our viewers will identify the left with progressivism. And I think I said this at the Sohrab Ahmari event in New York with Sublation, that, you know, I don't want to be the Marxist who denies the possibility of progressive capitalist reforms. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to just say, oh, no, Marxism tells you how impossible reforms are. No, they are possible. So the only issue is, how are they going to happen? And are these progressive reforms? What does progressive reform really mean in this context? And so I feel like, you know, they can make certain changes. They do seem to be making certain changes. They also seem to be building on changes that Trump had begun. And that also could be traced further back even into the Obama era. And so, you know, there is a kind of, but it's very thin and it's very fragile, and it's also very murky, like how it's happening. And it's hidden behind this bipartisan strife, you know, like we're on the verge of a budget, you know, conflict, government shutdown, drama, something or other. We've got other things going on like the UAW strike. And so tantalizingly, it's like there seems to be a possibility of progressive reform of capitalism.
Mhm.
So then how does it elude us? Right. And I think that becomes the thing that sucks the left in. Like, your backstop against that is the Ukraine war and the police state.
Mhm.
Those are some backstops against that. But let's say they didn't do the Ukraine war. Let's say they did say, you know what, this surveillance state is counterproductive and out of control, and so we're not going to keep pushing this. Would that change how we're regarding it in terms of socialism and capitalism and etc.?
It would not change my conviction that we still had to overcome the contradictory crisis that is capitalism. But I would not put Biden at the number one slot in my list of terrible presidents. You know, if he hadn't brought us into this war that's so threatening in Ukraine, and if there wasn't a international movement started in the United States that under Trump, but not by Trump, to suppress the civil society, to rule out oppositional politics. But it was not with COVID. No, it was with Trump.
That's true. And it
2017. It started in 2017.
They blamed Russia for Brexit too. Let's not forget.
Right. No, it was the populist movements that around the West, and particularly Trump, that then gave them the capacity or motivated the bureaucratic state.
I think they even said that Macron's election, when he replaced the socialist president in France, exhibited like Russian meddling. Right.
And even all of that, by the way, all of that was a lie. There was no, I mean, we've now know that there was no justification for tying Trump or any of these things to look. Just the other day, Trudeau applauded a Nazi in the parliament, right, in Canada, along with everyone else. They didn't know somehow that this 98-year-old Ukrainian Nazi was a Nazi, and they all said, oh, he's a hero, Canadian hero. And he apologized for it after the fact. And his next line was, and which only goes to show how we have to stand up to Russian disinformation.
Man, I know.
So, I know. My, you know, like, if Biden had taken office and said, oh, the attacks, the whole thing about Russian disinformation was untrue. We need to roll back this censorship apparatus that was built by an out of control state bureaucracy under Trump. And we need to start negotiating.
Face. In other words, you'd think that they've had various off ramps, they've had various outs, right? In other words, they could have used the Mueller report, even. Right? They could have used, like, there was a Horowitz report, like a kind of, kind of internal audit, like a kind of ethical investigation of the Department of Justice, right? They could have used these to say, you know what, things got out of hand. And then, you know, the public would have moved on and people would have happily forgotten, right? So it's not like it wouldn't have been cripplingly embarrassing to them. And so, you know, but they also are capable of making mistakes.
Well, I just think it works. I just think that the problem that they're facing, I think they're not entirely irrational. And I think the difficulty they're facing runs deeper, and that they're actually seeing that this political crisis is going to come. And this is gearing up for it. This is trying to put and developing the weapons on how to deal with it during.
The reason I say that they are not incapable of making mistakes is that we need to understand that they can talk themselves to things, and they can believe their own bullshit, right? So, like, even like, I don't know, I'll say this somewhat controversially, like the Iraq War, right? The invasion of Iraq. They might have believed that Saddam Hussein was doing something.
Have weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's a very elastic category. It's biological, chemical, and nuclear. So they might have had good information that the nuclear program was done, right? But they might have chosen to say, but we can't be absolutely sure, and why isn't he letting us see? And they couldn't acknowledge obvious things, which is that if you go in and see that he has no nuclear weapons, that might be bad for him vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but Chris,
right?
Chris, this is something I wanted to raise to you. Having read your book and loud, you are forgetting that the weapons inspectors were allowed in to Iraq in the last month before the invasion. That the weapons inspectors themselves said there were no weapons of mass destruction there, and that the UN declared the invasion to be illegal.
The invasion, yeah.
Yeah. So, in other words, not justified by anything they found in the. So it's not true that Saddam refused to allow UN inspectors in. He did allow them in a timely enough manner that it could have been the justification not to invade.
Right.
His kicking that's buying into Bush administration propaganda that they did have access to all the different areas that could have been weapons manufacturing in Iraq during the few months before the invasion.
During the immediate lead up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd have to re-examine this history and think about it some more. I mean, my point there, I'm always interested, You
got involved in the peace movement in 2006. I was involved in it in 2003, right?
Yeah, I wasn't. I mean, I was not unsympathetic to the anti-war movement around Afghanistan. It's not that I was unsympathetic. Right. It's that I wasn't particularly engaged, and I was only engaged in the Iraq stuff. Well, because it was this massive phenomenon, and because my students were involved in a way that they weren't quite yet before 2003. Right. And in many respects, they only got more involved going up to 2006. But I was there. I went to the demos and whatnot. And I was paying attention to the news. And I was paying close attention to the rhetoric of the administration. And I was sympathetic to things like the Valerie Plame affair and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Although even that is a more complicated story.
Yeah, it is.
Than the liberal narrative.
Right? I may have the false impression, but my feeling at the time was that in order to be a dedicated anti-war activist, what you needed to do was read the New York Times and the Guardian. Not because the New York Times and the Guardian were saying this is an illegal war that needs to be stopped, but because if you read closely, you would find out that the invasion of Iraq, the war, that there had been a war against Iraq through the no-fly zone.
Of course.
Right.
Continuously. And I did put it out in the book.
Yeah, right.
I guess my rhetorical point, but I do think that it has substance, is, a lot of capitalist policy is venal and crooked and criminal and also incompetent, but also delusional. A lot of it is, but I think that we, people use this language, right? We have to steelman the argument, right?
Right, I agree.
And so I do think that we have to grant the rationality of capitalist politics, at least on some level, at least at a kind of a face value level. The delusional character of capitalist politics is, to my mind, operating at a much deeper level. Yeah. And so that's why I say things like, can you tell the difference between them lying to you, them believing their own lies, or them sincerely thinking that it's the truth? Where do you do that?
Yeah, no, I do think that there's a good chance that they on some level believe their own lies. Like these people who talk about the threat of disinformation, they do believe
it. Or even Fauci with COVID. At some level, he also thinks, he does massage things and do this. So I wanted to say something in response to the people who screamed bloody murder in our last video.
Yeah.
I want to say about, the vaccines and masks, because people were like, oh, Chris Cutrone should stay in his lane and not, comment on things, as if there can't be public sphere discussion of, people.
There was one comment in particular on YouTube where he's really good on politics, he's terrible about COVID, and then they link to this guy who argues, I think disingenuously or at least in error, that the fact that there weren't any real studies done to show that the vaccine stopped transmission was no big deal. And the reality is that the vaccines, the studies that were done that show that there was it slowed or stopped transmission were done in the very early days,
right,
on the very first variant,
right,
and that it was known that there would be mutations, and it was also known that study was probably not adequate. And then as things went along, it became more and more well known that the vaccine was doing very little to stop transmission. And yet the political message was still, if you don't get vaccinated, you're killing people. If you don't get...
Well, they also thought that it stopped transmission, like, for a few months or something, right? In other words, they always had like a qualified notion. So there was that comment. The other comment was about like condoms and HIV. And I know that we've talked about that in the past. And so the last time we talked about it in a very abbreviated way that was not really the point, which is to say that Fauci said that you had to convince people wearing the condom that they were protecting themselves, whereas actually they were protecting their partners.
Right.
In other words, the penetrative partner is not at very high risk of catching HIV anyway. But you have to scare them into thinking that if they don't wear a condom, they'll catch HIV. Right? Whereas really you're protecting their partners. Right? And it's very much like the masks. In other words, you have to make people feel like they're protecting themselves when they're wearing the masks, but what they're really doing is protecting others.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And the best way they're doing that is by not going out at all.
Right. And the best way to do that is to not go out at all, because of course, wearing the mask doesn't protect you. Because when you breathe, the air comes in on the sides. When you breathe in. When you breathe out, it goes through the mask. When you breathe in, it comes around the sides.
Right.
Even with the N95, right? Because the N95 is meant to be worn for a brief period of time for people who are working with hazardous chemicals in an industrial setting. It's not meant to be worn for 8 hours or something. It's not. It doesn't work like that, right? And it protects you against like things like in the air, like particles and chemicals. It doesn't protect you against viruses, right? In that way, right? And so, again, it gives you more protection than a surgical mask breathing in, but it still doesn't ultimately, right? So all that they can do is say, do this and that, but the real message is don't go out, don't socialize. Don't do what they call community spread.
Listen, we went about a half hour over what I normally would say we would do. So let's take 5 minutes. Do you want to take 5-10 minutes and then do another hour? In the next section, I want to talk to you about Hegel and be more philosophical
about the left.
Yeah, and also, I guess before we sign off here, I just want to say, I think that Zizek said something that I feel is intuitively correct, and you tell me if you think this is true. That if there's going to be reforms to capitalism that are going to be for the best, in a humane way, that they're not going to occur without a left, without a struggle for a utopian other dimension.
Well, that's an old idea, right? You need to threaten revolution to get reform.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, but we can talk about that in terms of how we understand history. In other words, how we understand like the 20th century, how we understand things like the FDR New Deal, like why did that happen? Where did that come from? Yes.
I guess I particularly think of it in this moment where we need to be able to say extreme things or point beyond what is and have the freedom to do so if we're going to be able to even fight against, let's say, future lockdowns, or if we're going to be...
I'm not happy with that kind of formulation, because I do think it's what we were talking about earlier, that the left has become a matter of extreme rhetoric and the protest demo culture and screaming very loudly and protesting very fervently. And I feel like that ignores the fact that the old socialist left was actually relatively quiet. I mean, in other words, I always like to say Vladimir Lenin never attended a protest demo. Neither did Rosa Luxemburg. Now, of course, that's not true. That's a kind of an ad absurdum kind of point. But this is not what they thought. This is not where they thought the action was.
Right.
I mean, they gave speeches, but to very well-behaved crowds. They weren't agitators. And, they were sympathetic, and they might have gone out on the street when there were demonstrations, but mostly to figure out what was going on. In other words, they weren't like mounting the barricades. They weren't like leading the street demo. Like that wasn't what they thought, right? They thought what you do is you quietly organize the working class until you're ready to take power, right? So it wasn't this kind of spectacular stuff that we associate. And that really has more to do with right-wing politics, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of street action. That's fascist. Like street action. I always like to point out that youth movements, before the 60s, youth movements were almost always right-wing. Like people running out on the street and smashing things up, that was always the right. It was like nationalists. It was those kinds of people, right? That was not left-wing. That was not. So, you know, again, we have a very twisted, warped notion of the struggle for socialism.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.